Hello and welcome to Fireside Fairytales. If you've never been here before, welcome, and this is Varietal Literature's YouTube channel. Varietal Literature is a group of writers from Vancouver who have fun with narrative. And what we do on Tuesday nights is we read old folk tales and fairy tales. And in particular, tonight we are reading about something that the translator has classed as pressure spirits, which is a fair enough classification for them, but some of these spirits are a little more literal in their pressure. Some of them kind of pressure them to do stuff. We're gonna kind of just dive into the more literal side of these spirits that sort of crawl on backs and crush or have a compulsion to squeeze people. It's very unsettling. This is not a particularly gruesome episode or anything. We do have those. Just as a content warning up top, it is an unsettling topic. On the whole, the stories turn out okay, not all of them, but you should know. That's what we're going to do tonight. A little bit of sound effects, a little bit of fire in the background, a little bit of music, while I read you old folk tales. In this case, they're all German folk tales that were translated by Jürgen Hubert, who is a contemporary translator who has a Patreon, which I will put in the pinned comment when this video is not live. And you should support him there because he's translating stuff that's never been in English before. And, well, I think they're really cool stories. It's a good deal. Also, though, if you want to get on to the stories or you have particular stories that interest you tonight, down in the description below, there will be timestamps if you are not watching this live. You just click on a timestamp, takes you to whichever interests you the most. Tonight will be, I think, on the shorter side, although every time I say that, it usually just winds up being average length. But we're going to look at 5 tales. Actually, a little more than 5 tales. One is a collection of 2 tales. All of which deal with this idea of spirits that inexplicably need to crush or squeeze or both people. And what I'm interested in is what you in the chat think is the reason for them doing this. There are sort of cryptic clues in the stories, but it's odd, to put it mildly. And it is prevalent. This isn't a one-off thing. There are lots of stories. I've actually only selected some of them to read. Which kind of goes to what is currently the title of this video. May have changed by this point. But why do some spirits in folklore squeeze or crush people either to death or to near death through exhaustion? And the truth is very little direct explanation is given, but I think there are clues in the story. So I'm curious to see how people in the chat, if you are here live, can pick up on those clues and what your best theory is as to what is going on. Now, I do have one kind of boring materialistic theory on this, which is I wonder, at least, if the idea of some of the ones that ride on your back when you're traveling are merely descriptions of a certain symptom of heart attack. Because you can survive heart attacks, and back in the day, they may not have really known them. And, well, the popular one is chest. There's a lot of people who present it across their back. It's more common in women, but it comes to both. There you go. There you've learned something tonight. And sometimes it can come across as tension or squeezing. And considering how many of these have to do with travelers coming back from long days of work or whatever else, it is feasible to me that what they're describing is a mild heart attack symptom, or angina even, although angina tends to not manifest in the back. But that's sort of my loose theory on it. I don't know if it really lines up with all the descriptions. Yeah. I don't think there's anything else I need to add. Mild content warning. Translator is Jürgen Hubert. And we are going to turn down the fire a little bit, and we're going to get to our stories. GS says pent-up anger or a repression. It's possible. See if you find support for that in the story. Because I will say the stories are not too clear on anything, really, which isn't terribly unusual for folklore. So we're going to do a mixture of like stories. As usual, we try to end on our most complete stories. So the Trudes, our last story of the night, is the most like 3-act structure with some development, though it is pretty abstract and strange still, about this topic. The first couple, though, are going to be very short little vignettes and urban myths and legends about people who've traveled and had weird things happen to them in this regard. Let me get some water, and we'll get to the spirits. Okay. Let's do a little bit of wind, a little bit of rain. Perhaps a little less volume on it. Our first story tonight is called The Back Squatting Spirit. It comes from the translator Jürgen Hubert, who you can support by clicking on the link in the pinned comment below. It is a translation of an old German folktale about back squatting spirits, specifically one known as the Aufwacher, which please remember to like, because I think YouTube is going to think that's the F word and probably push this out of the algorithm. Uncanny forces are said to be at work at a spot roughly in the middle between Plata and Schwerin, where the road leading to Schwerin is crossed by the cart path. Now, 6 years ago, the house painter T walked back to the city after his daily work was done in Plata. Then he saw a figure coming to meet him at the crossroads. She was clothed in black, appeared large and gaunt, with a bald plate on her head and long white teeth she was constantly showing, as well as long, thin fingers. He considered whether he should address her or simply proceed on his way, and decided on the latter. Well, as soon as he took a few steps, the thing sat down on his basket with his painter's tools. Well, he dragged himself forward under the greatest effort. After he had taken about 400 steps, he reached a place where a path went off the road to the right. Now at this point, the figure jumped off and pushed him a few steps forward. He didn't dare look back immediately because his head might have become stuck askew. When he finally did look back, though, after some time had passed, nothing could be seen. That's our first foray, and it's a good sampler of what's to come, which is there is strange travelers, often old women, theorized to be witches or so on. And, you try to figure out the right thing to do, and each and every time they crawl on your back or something like that and exhaust you. Now, this one doesn't emphasize the exhaustion as much, but the next one does. Now, the next story is called The Back Squatting Woman, as opposed to Spirit. And it also comes from Jürgen Hubert, his collection Sunken Castles, Evil Poodles, which you can support his Patreon in the pinned comment below. And it also concerns spirits that crush travelers. 3 journeyman millers who worked at the Fallen Rost mill once went to some Kruger pub in Rittermanshagen after work. And when they were on their way home, perhaps a little cut, and reached a crossroads, one journeyman called out to the other, "Look, someone is sitting there." While the 2 other journeymen who couldn't see anything asked their comrade, who was a Sunday child, Coda? Footnote. Sunday child, apparently, this is from Jürgen's notes, means the child was born on Sunday, and there was a sort of superstition that people born on Sunday could see the spirit realm clearer or see things that weren't really there. Who was a Sunday child, what he was seeing. "There's an old woman crouching in the thorn bush," he replied. But since he was a stout-hearted fellow, he walked to the thorn bush in order to talk to the woman he spotted there. But as soon as he reached the bush, the 2 others he had left behind heard a loud yell. Deeply frightened, they fled into the night, their co-worker only reaching the mill a few hours later. His entire body was wet with sweat, I assume, and he was barely able to stand due to his exhaustion. Well, the next morning, he told his fellow journeyman that the old woman had immediately jumped on his back and caused him great hardship. Despite his trying his best to shake her off, the old hag stuck to his back as if she had roots in him, and he was only able to get rid of her just before he reached the mill. Well, from now on, the journeyman was no longer able to get to Rittermanshagen in the evenings without a challenge, for the old otherworldly woman sat on his back every time. In the end, she even came to the mill and waited for him there, and she called to him to come out when he was milling flour at night. In the end, this was too much for the beleaguered journeyman miller. Thus he packed his bundle, and took his wanderer's staff, and traveled out into the world. Now that story, we get an interesting, almost metaphorical look of it, where it seems to be about... Well, I mean, I'm going to pull a little bit from Jürgen's notes here, though this is a thing I knew before. He's a journeyman, and journeymen are, especially at this time, intended to go and travel around and learn from other masters. Journeyman is not an apprentice, but they're not a master, right? So the idea is that you apprentice for a while, and then usually under a single master, usually like or even just one shop, which was usually one guy, but it could be more than one. But then you would become a journeyman, and a journeyman was supposed to go on a journey, man. Let's shut the channel down with that one. And it's interesting because it seems to be that she is largely harrying is the word I'm looking for. Harrying his ability to go and get drunk at a pub and stay where he is when he's clearly not supposed to be doing that. And so, finally exhausted by that lifestyle, he goes off and does what he probably should have done in the first place, which is interesting. It's like a moralist tale for journeymen, specifically laborers that are meant to go out and learn. GS says, she's obsessed. That is the theme here. See, that is an interesting explanation of the journeyman and the woman on his back. But what that doesn't really address is what is going on with these spirits. And they only get stranger. Obsession is a theme here. One might even say they're sort of compelled or addicted to it. We'll see that most clearly with the Trudes, our last story. But before then, let's go on to our next story, which is the rather unsettlingly named Howling Mother. So this is the Howling Mother, which is a collection of a couple of folk tales collected out of Germany and translated by Jürgen Hubert, who you can support in the pinned comment below. A miner from Sellerfeld once went home to the late in the evening, and on his path home he found the Howling Mother sat on his path and howled, and one leg was on the fence on one side of the road, and the other leg was on a fence on the other side. Since the miner was not easily intimidated, he walked straight through beneath the Howling Mother stretched between the two fences. And it was at this moment she knocked his hat off his head. Well, the miner knew well enough to leave the hat laying there. But when he reached home, a woman was living there. He told her that he had lost his hat and asked her to bring the hat to him. Such courage. And told her that it would probably be lying between the two fences. Well, the woman went there and picked up the hat, but as soon as she had arrived at the house, the Howling Mother was outside. She howled terribly and threatened the entire house. When they had had enough of this terrible house-shuddering howling, they threw the hat out of the window. And with this, she calmed down. But the hat was found the next morning on the street, ripped to shreds. Second tale about the Howling Mother. Around 50 or 60 years ago, a minesmith went to work in his mine at around 1 o'clock in the morning. As he was walking along the Selbach stream and came through the so-called Proktgashien alley, he heard a delicate and thin voice which spoke to him. Stand still. Stand still. But he knew that the woman who lived in the small house along the street was a witch, and thought, this is the witch. She wants to play a prank on you. He thus started to run as fast as he could, but immediately he heard the pattering, repelling, and screaming, and cheering in a manner that he was almost deafened, and yet he did not see anything. And suddenly there was a jolt, and he felt a heavy load on his shoulder, as if a human had sat down on them, and their legs were hanging down in front. He also felt how her fingers tore into his skin like claws, and the thing did not leave him before he had opened the door to the entrance of the lower Bergstedt lode, where he had arrived utterly exhausted. Then the creature struck him on the back with such force that he fell into the building and was bereft of his senses, and only recovered from his ordeal after several hours. In the evening, when he got home, he he still had the black spots on his shoulders and his back. So with the Howling Mother, Gia says they represent guilt. I mean, the second one sounds like the guy's just cheating on his wife, honestly. Just made up a tale. But the first one is, well, it's something, isn't it? Okay. Our next story is called The Church in Altenau. It comes to us translated by Jürgen Hubert, who you can support in the pinned comment below. A long time ago, there was a man in Altenau named Fox. His trade was ringing the bells and winding the clock. Specifically, the church clock. And he was a cobbler as well. Once he forgot to wind the church clock during the day, and he only thought of it between 11 and 12 o'clock in the evening. To rectify his negligence, he put on clothes, picked up the keys, and went to the church. He unlocked the door, but closed it behind him, and walked up the stairs and opened the clock chamber and winded the clock without anything peculiar happening. He locked the clock chamber again and walked downstairs. Suddenly, when he covered half the distance and was approximately on the second set of stairs, something like a large dog leapt on his back and held fast on his shoulders with both hands, in a manner that hurt quite a bit. He was unable to move this load, but he once heard that you are supposed to swear violently when a spirit wants to hurt you, or if you encounter a spirit. "All cursed thunderstorm shall carry you away from my back." And he swore, and as he swore, the clock struck 12. And when the spirit left his back, but he hurried towards the door, unlocked it, and then slammed it shut. He was barely able to concentrate on his path, befuddled as he was from the terror and pain, and he was unable to utter a single word after he had sworn like this. As he arrived home, he immediately laid down and whimpered and groaned constantly, and his wife asked him what was wrong with him, but he was unable to speak. He was lying like this for 3 days. Near the end, he was able to speak once more, and he told his wife everything, and he died on the 3rd day. And when they undressed him afterwards, an impression of a coal-black hand was on each of his shoulders, and its fingers had been deeply pressed into his flesh. In Altenau, the night guard also once observed that the church was illuminated at night. In fact, they saw that it was visited by white-clad men, and there was a white-clad preacher before the altar. He also witnessed this the following night and the night after, and on the 3rd night, the priest of Altenau, at the time, was already waiting in the complete black dress of his office and carrying his church books. As they agreed in advance, the night guard fetched him. The priest now stepped into the church, and the white preacher immediately vanished from the altar. But when he stepped in front of the altar and recited something from his books, the entire white congregation vanished as well, and it became dark inside that church. The priest of Altenau did not preach again afterwards, for he was constantly ill and soon died. is it guilt? Like, you feel like you follow along with that first clock one. You're like, oh, okay, I get it. It's, he messed up doing a chore for the church and he's been punished for it or something like that, which, is in keeping with how folklore goes. But then you get to, like, the priest goes in, and I think what is interesting is how much it doesn't seem to tie to any particular moral. It more is about how, the other realm, the other side is a dangerous thing to interact with. Gia says, wow, that was a scary story. Well, hopefully not too scary. Which brings us to the Trudes. I can't find anything on Trudes. Couldn't find a reference to them. Maybe it's mostly locked to German, and therefore the English internet wasn't really up on it. But unlike the ones we've seen so far, which sit on your back and crush you, the Trudes, our last story of the night, and the longer of all the stories, is about ones that have an insatiable need to squeeze. And for my money, is one of the creepier pieces of folklore. I was tempted to hold this off for Halloween, but the fact of the matter is there's just too many creepy stories to fit into 4 weeks once a year. Now, since this story opens in a forest, actually, I forgot to look at the pronunciation of Trudes. It might be Truda, honestly. If you're wondering, I don't really know anything about German. I just go and look at websites and punch in words and try to learn them. All right. There we go. I'm gonna take the rain down. Our next story is called The Trudes. It comes from the translations by Jürgen Hubert, whose Patreon is in the pinned comment below, and you should definitely support. Many years ago, in the night before Epiphany, 2 old women arose from their holes in the forest and set forth on the path to Anhornbauer farm, to the Anhornbauer farmer. They were full of wrinkles, ugly to look at, with short gray hair, and each carried an ash stick. These were evil Trudes, who committed nefarious deeds against humans and cattle alike all night long. And when they had arrived at the farm, they stepped into the main chamber where a fire had already been kindled. The married couple owning the farm had already sat down for their dinner. The Trudes, pretending to be on a pilgrimage to Sankt Erman, asked for food and a place to stay for the night. In exchange, they promised to pray for them at Sankt Erman. The farmer, a God-fearing man, agreed to this request, but his young wife, who was pregnant, had ill premonitions about this. The Trudes spoke much of the holy matters, and the couple, sitting at the spinning wheel, listened with much astonishment. As the 11th hour approached, one of the Trudes, who was named Moss, whispered to the other, who was called Khan, that she couldn't stand it anymore. She had to go and squeeze a living being. Khan told her to be calm, for they should not harm their benefactors. But as the 11th hour approached, Moss was no longer able to contain herself and went into the chamber of the junior maid, who had gone to bed early. However, the maid was careful and had pointed the tips of her shoes outwards away from her bed, and therefore the Trude was not able to touch her. Thus thwarted, the witch ran into the stables, but all the animals were locked away, and the gates to their stalls were sealed with holy symbols after good Christian tradition. Even the farm dog had a blessed amulet around its neck, and from all this frustration, Moss became crazed and hugged a tree lying in the yard until she squeezed herself to death. Meanwhile, everyone in the farm had gone to sleep, but the farmer's wife felt unwell and realized that she was close to childbirth. The senior farmhand thus had to mount their sorrel horse and ride to Qualmberg in order to get the priest and the barber. We've mentioned before that barber was sort of like a middle ground between a trained doctor and no one. Noticing this, Khan, one of the Trudes, sat down on the back of the horse. The fear of the farmhand was hardly describable, for the Trude weighed it down like lead on the horse, and no matter how hard he drove it onward, the animal would hardly move an inch. Finally, the church bells rang for their morning prayers, and with them the witch startled and quickly jumped off the horse. But the farmhand, who was a clever man, called after the old woman, "Come back today and borrow something." Immediately he heard crying and wailing, causing him to almost regret his words. Well, at the 9th hour he returned to Ahornvies, the castle chaplain and the barber in tow, and when they arrived there was much fear and confusion, as the squashed Trude had been discovered, and there was fear that the newborn child had come to harm. But the new mother and her child were healthy and well. Then Khan, who was not as far gone as the evil Moss, returned. Crying, she begged for a pan with which she could make some mush for the newborn child. Everyone opposed her. The priest made warding prayers against her, the maids arrived with fire hooks and brooms, and the farmhands with pitchforks and flails so they could beat her down. But it was the old barber, who had found the mother and child to be healthy, who was well versed in all magical arts and contemplated the Trude's request, that stopped the abuse against her. Now Khan became cheerful. The farmers were surprised, for now she no longer appeared as an ugly old woman to them. I like how that's just the worst thing in the world. But beautiful and lovely. You could be an old woman and beautiful, by the way. She stepped behind the stove and cooked a tasteful mush for the child, and from that moment on she became the children's maid for the Anhornwieser family, and helped him raise 10 children. She was no longer called a Trude, but Gertrude, and she no longer was a cursed person, but rather a good Christian. She sang lovely songs to the children, spoke of Christ to them, and there were good fortunes and blessings within the house. She lived for a long time, too, and was kept in high honors when she became too old to work. Finally, she died a peaceful death at an age of more than 200 years, surrounded by the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the long-dead original Ahornwieser family. Well, look, it did actually end early, as per usual. We do have some translator's notes, but if you're just here for the stories, thank you very much. And please remember to like and consider subscribing if you haven't already. We do lots of different tales from sort of mostly Northern Europe, but all around anyways. Gia says, well, that's interesting. She was compelled to squeeze, that she's so compelled to squeeze that she squeezed herself to death. Yeah, it's not clear that they get what they need from this. I will say that. GS says, oh, acceptance lifted her evil urge to squeeze. I think it does fit with that sort of classic Catholic idea of sort of like by mercy and grace are people lifted. But it is interesting here because there is no real reason to believe that she's a human being. She crawls out of a hole in the forest. She lives to 200 years, and she shapeshifts and changes and has weird compulsions. Like, she has every measure of not being a true human being, but rather something from, you know, the other side, whatever you want to define. I mean, fae is a word for it, but there's lots of different versions of it. And usually, because those things have sources in pagan beliefs of an area, they're usually beyond redemption. It's always like humans can be redeemed, but not the fae. They thirst for it, but they can't. And yet in this one, we see her redeemed by that grace, which makes it kind of unique. I don't know really actually of any other, I mean, I don't know all stories, but I don't know of any other story in any of the books I've read, of which there are many on folklore, where we see a sort of non-human redeemed into Christianity. That's unusual. Okay. Let's take a look at our translator's notes. This is from last week's video, I believe, which was about dogs. There we go. This section of the show is called Translator's Notes, and it's because we read stuff from contemporary translators who sometimes come and leave me comments, and I want to give them a chance to speak to the audience on the whole. And these comments are concerning the video last week, which was about creepy supernatural dogs in German folklore. And the comments come from Jürgen Hubert, who also translated the stories this week. The screen will stay up, so you know that it's not me saying it. As usual, some comments. This is from Jürgen now. Germany has its own will-o-wisp variants called Irrlicht. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. Roughly translates to errant, mad confusion light, which is about what it is in other languages as well. They are most commonly interpreted as ghosts of some kind, but often appear with no explanation. Many of the German folktales I've come across have no title, and in many other cases the title was added by the collectors, something I've done as well on more than a few occasions. This might contribute to the descriptive nature of these titles, such as the Club Dog. After all, most of the tales were transcripts and summaries of oral tales where titles were not needed. This is me speaking, Rory, for a moment. That's in reference to, I made a comment that it was very straightforwardly named in the German tradition, because it was about a dog with a club around its neck. The desire to do something forever is most commonly associated with wild hunt narratives, such as hunting forever, though it is not exclusive for them. And that is me speaking again. That is in reference to the fish hound, which was a man who wanted to only fish rather than go to heaven. And I had mentioned that it reminded me of Frau Gauden. who is a part of the Wild Hunt mythos in certain parts of Germany. Returning to Jürgen's comments, regarding Princess Swanwith, I didn't think of it at the time when I translated the tale, but I do hope she at least managed to get clothes when she was imprisoned with the treasure hoard, or else her fate would have been even more humiliating than it was already. I mean, it was dark at least in there, Jürgen. I suppose that helps. Jürgen has a comment directly to one of our regular commenters and viewers of the channel, GS. GS had thanked Jürgen for his translations, and this is his response to that. When I started to read those tales, I knew that they were so special and that they should be shared with new audiences instead of remaining in some old 19th century books. I agree, Jürgen. Thus, it's very personally gratifying to me to see they are shared and discussed here and elsewhere. Well, I'm glad to do it. And then there is a note for me. It says, on that note, Rory, I do want to hear about how you used Frau Gauden in a D&D game, and maybe you could share that tale on Mastodon, which is a social media service that Jürgen and I share. It's how I met him. I can tell you about it now. I may yet put it on Mastodon. I did put, actually, I think the stat block on Mastodon. So to be clear, this is me telling my own sort of folk tales here. D&D, of course, is a tabletop RPG. Stands for Dungeons and Dragons. It's folk tales really at its core, by the way. D&D runs on folklore logic in terms of how its storyline and narrative and world is built. It's heavily folklore. And it is sort of just a structured, gamified version of a group of people creating a little community of stories. I want to say that ahead of time to justify me telling this story. So, since I started, I am what's called a dungeon master or a game master because I'm a writer and that's what I do. I create the world and then a group of people play in it. And since I've been doing that, every Christmas we would have Santa Claus come along and on our Christmas game. And you would give them some sort of, frankly, broken magic item that they would ask for in letters. And like, it was a fun thing to do. It is also particularly funny because D&D isn't really played in real time. Like a month of in-world game time might take 2 years to play through. So it would be like having Christmas twice in a month. Anyways, the point is, we always used to have Santa Claus come along. And it's kind of our own version of Santa Claus. He's really racist against elves and kind of exploitative. And at one point, my players organized the elves at his place in the North Pole into a union that went on strike. And then the next year, he gave them all really bad gifts for it because he was mad. So he has his own sort of version, right? I just want to make that clear. But when I read Frau Gauden's tales this year, they made such an impression on me. I loved the idea of this sort of unapologetically boisterous, true neutral hunter woman that rode around on storm clouds with her daughters turned to hounds and would gift people in dog crap that they would not take and then discover turns to gold the next morning. Like, she's just, I don't know, there was just such a weird, appealing energy about her as a character. And in many ways, I felt like, and I made this case in my reading of Frau Gauden, I felt like Frau Gauden was really had a lot of the roots of Santa Claus in it. In fact, the Wild Hunt in general has a lot of the roots of Santa Claus, which was the point of that episode. It's in the Fireside Fairytales. It's called, it's not Christmas until Odin raids the countryside. But it's about the Wild Hunt. And basically how it has all the pieces of Santa in the 20th century conception of him. And so what I did, they're in hell right now, my players. It's they're playing a module called Descent into Avernus. And Avernus is a layer of hell, and they're trying to save some people there. Well, they're trying to save a city there. So they're traveling around hell. And she came riding in on her storm cloud with her 30 dogs to save them from sinking in the river Styx. And what I did, because it's Christmas and we're all just having fun, was she gave them, this is some nerd stuff, so for people who don't know D&D, it's not going to mean anything. She gave everyone a casting of, I'm forgetting the name of it, doubles your actions and all of that. Haste, that's right. Gave them all, cast haste on them, and then each person was given a chance to down a target. And as we went through initiative, which is the count in combat, she had some very powerful like buffs she would put on their attacks and stuff. Because really what I wanted to create was not a balanced encounter. I wanted the feeling that you would have riding on the clouds with this. I'm taking a little bit from, it's theorized that a lot of the Wild Hunt stuff comes from Thor or Odin riding with the Valkyries for the 12 days of, well, we call it Christmas, but 12 days of feasting in the midwinter in Norse. But I was taking a bit from that route. And so she had a lightning bow strung with lightning and would fire lightning arrows into the sky that would rain lightning down. And they would ride at the head of the clouds and strike twice as hard as ever. And the one like very particular thing that I did was... I felt like Frau was a meat and bone, metal and brawn kind of person. She wasn't really into magic. She wanted the brutality of things. And so when the magic user used his fiddly little spells, and she would give him a wish for each thing that he downed, which was like dragons and devils and whatever else. When he downed it, he asked her for a magic item, like something that would buff his magic. And she mocked him for it. Threw lightning at his face and gave his reward to somebody who wanted something brawnier, which was like a sword or something. Because I see her as like true neutral. She has a very clear ethos. I did post, I'm pretty sure, her unbalanced stat block, let's be honest, on Mastodon, but I can repost it. But yeah, she rode around. They got these gifts as a reward for her bringing quarry to the hunt. But the one rule was they all had to eat some of the quarry, which comes from the stories that I read. And it did cause sickness and poisoning in the lawful good characters, but which is in keeping with some of the myth around her. Yeah, or what? Not so much her, the Wild Hunt in their meats. And then the final stab of it was when they got back to the docks of the banks of the River Styx, and she was about to ride away. Santa Claus was there, and he had hurt feelings. And I'd sort of set it up so that Santa Claus would give more magic items. So if they wanted to return all the stuff that Frau had given them, they could, and instead take whatever Santa Claus would give them. Santa Claus never gives anything to elves, though, which half the party was, because he was racist. You would give them things that would help them better serve the other better people to him. Anyways, that is the rambling story of Frau Gauden in my game. They rode around hell and downed an ancient dragon and a pit fiend and whatnot. Things that way above their level because of the crazy buffs of haste and extra damage she put on all their weapons for riding in the clouds with her dogs. And it was great fun. We played Ride of the Valkyries, by the way, and I played it once as sort of its effect because it is indeed rooted in the Ride of the Valkyries, so I thought that was funny. But my players just wanted the song to keep playing, so for the entire 4-hour game we just looped Ride of the Valkyries. Anyways, that is Frau Gauden in my D&D game. GS says, thank you, Rory, for sharing these incredible translated tales. I've never heard of squeezing spirits. How fascinating. I hadn't either. But, now we have. Maybe it'll inspire further thoughts for people. Anyways, I have my own folktale to get back to, which is, of course, playing Tears of the Kingdom. Which is very folktale in its structure. And I'm sure you have a life to get on to. So I have been Rory. I'll keep the fire going for you. You have a good sleep. And watch your back.